discussed it so often.
Do take your seats.
But unfortunately,
And we must get on because we just have 1 hour to resolve a little local difficulty. For the next hour, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to discuss a subject which is very, very close to my heart, which is the insane decision of the British electorate, apparently, to vote to leave the European Union. I put my cards on the table straight away. For those of you who live in Munich will know that in the district of Alt-Schwabing, there is a little street called the Ockhamstrasse. And you may know that the Ockhamstrasse was named after a gentleman called William of Ockham, who was an English monk and a very thoughtful and distinguished intellectual, but he fell out with the Pope in Avignon, and he was given asylum here in Munich, where he cultivated his thinking along the lines of Ockham's razor, with which some of you may be familiar. All I want to say is this: when we need it, please give us asylum in Munich. We've seen this extraordinary decision, and what I'm going to do with our panel is I'm going to turn first to John Peet, as if he hasn't done enough work already. He's done very little else for the last 3 months but cover this referendum campaign. And I want to ask John just to tell us, why has the British electorate taken this decision, which is not by a very wide margin at all, and John did not predict it, as he will admit. Secondly, what its consequences are, and maybe thirdly, whether John wants to tackle that, or I'll ask the others to look at how the hell we get out of this mess. But John, why did we get into this mess?
Let me try and tackle that in 3 ways. A quick comment on why we had the referendum, a comment on why Leave won. As you say, I did not expect that, although I did think it would be very close. And a quick comment on what we might do now. Why we had the referendum, I mean, you have to go back to the history of the Conservative Party, Margaret Thatcher's downfall in 1990, and the Maastricht Treaty. This referendum was a long time brewing, particularly within the Conservative Party. But it's a bit bigger than that. I think the growth of Euroscepticism, not just in Britain, but in the rest of Europe, played a very big role in the determination of certain people in the Conservative Party to have a referendum on whether to stay in the European Union. And the rise of the UK Independence Party and Nigel Farage clearly posed something of a threat to the Conservative Party, just as we have seen in several other countries in Europe with populist parties of the right. And I think that then the explosion of the euro crisis made a huge difference to the psychology inside Britain. Of course, you could say to British people, as I repeatedly said, well, Britain is not in the euro. But the fact that the euro crisis happened and was then followed by a migration crisis contributed to this idea that somehow or other the European project was failing. And it made the psychology of British voters totally different from 1975, a very important point to have about this referendum. In 1975, British voters thought that Britain was a basket case, and we really needed to copy the economic success of Europe. Now, particularly post-Euro crisis, I think people in Britain had the view, rightly or wrongly, that the British economy was a very successful economy and that somehow or other continental Europe was failing. And I think that was probably the most important single reason, both for having the referendum and for the referendum then being lost. And the final thing to say on the referendum is, my belief is that when David Cameron promised a referendum in January 2013, he did so in the expectation that he would be continuing with a coalition government after 2015 and that he would not have to deliver that promise. And I think the fact that the Conservatives won in May 2015 presented him immediately with a terrible dilemma. He'd promised the referendum, he now had to deliver it. So I think the background was unhelpful.
John, can I interrupt with just one thought? To what extent, though, was this referendum actually not about Europe at all and almost entirely about immigration?
Well, I'm just going to come on to because I think that's answering the question of why did Leave win. And I think I would answer the question of why did Leave win, partly with that point. It became clear to me as a watcher of this campaign, not just for 3 months, but for the last 9 months, that the economic case was overwhelming. And several think tank economists have said, indeed last week, they said that in their lifetime they have never seen such a unanimous view among economists that the case for leaving was very bad and the effects of leaving would be very bad. But curiously, many voters simply didn't believe it. And I think this phrase that came out from Michael Gove of the British people have had enough of experts resonated a lot during this campaign. The British people were told repeatedly by economic experts this would be a disastrous thing to do, but they chose to ignore that advice. And I think there are two reasons for that. The first is the one you mentioned, that migration became an overwhelmingly important issue. And it wasn't just about the refugee crisis, it was just the general feeling that's grown and been propagated particularly by the UK Independence Party, but also by some in the Conservative Party, that migration is out of control, that it's too high, that the promise made by David Cameron to reduce migration to the tens of thousands was undeliverable so long as Britain was in the European Union. And I think that became the biggest calling card for the Leave campaign. And the correlation between those who voted Leave and those who think migration was too high was extremely strong in all the polling evidence. So I think migration did become the big take control thing, and the Remain campaign did not have an answer. There was no real attempt to explain why migration was beneficial, why British people benefited from being able to work elsewhere in the European Union. They preferred to avoid the subject altogether, and I think that was probably a mistake. But the second thing, which I think also has resonance across Europe and even in the United States, was the growth of this feeling of anti-establishment, anti-elite, anti-globalization feeling among the people who feel they have not done well in the last 20 years. And you saw it very strongly in the voting results. The voting results from places like Sunderland, Middlesbrough, Hartlepool, Blackpool, Margate, Clacton. These are areas which feel, first of all, they feel hostile to migration, but they also believe that London has benefited from globalization, that Oxford and Cambridge have benefited from globalization, but that they have not. And they are typically working class and upper working class voters who believe that the last 20 years have been bad for them. And they deserted the Labour Party. The Labour Party's performance in this referendum was feeble, mainly because its leader clearly doesn't like the European Union, but also because they've lost touch with a large chunk of what was the old Labour vote, many of whom have drifted over towards the UK Independence Party because they believe that they have lost out from globalization. But the final comment, before making one point about where we go from here, is that I think the other lesson of this referendum is that if you, David Cameron in particular, but not just David Cameron, if you spend 10 years telling people the European Union is a pretty terrible institution and that it only generates regulations, that actually we'd be better off out, that we would indeed thrive out, and in less than a year ago he was still saying I might indeed campaign to leave the European Union. If you do that, it is very difficult to reverse that position in 4 months. And when David Cameron started to tell people we need to be in Europe for security reasons, for foreign policy reasons, we need to worry about the fact that Putin would be pleased by Brexit, the question that he could never answer was, if you feel all that, why did you say 1 year ago that you might actually advocate a decision to leave the European Union? So I think his position was always going to be weak in this referendum, having campaigned and put across the message that somehow or other membership of the European Union was not a good thing for the UK. And really, he should have started much earlier, as long ago as 2013 or earlier, to try and address the question of why it was better to stay in than to leave.
But John,
which I think is what Wilson did in 1975.
It was a debate between two hypocrites.
Yes.
David Cameron, who actually was fundamentally Eurosceptic and pretended to answer that he wanted to stay, and Boris Johnson, who is actually quite pro-European and pretended to answer to leave. Why did one hypocrite get caught and the other hypocrite escape?
Well, I mean, the answer to that is, of course, it was a very narrow result, 52-48. And I think it's telling, two things are telling about the result, and then maybe I'll stop and we can move on to talk about what next. Old people voted overwhelmingly to leave, young people voted overwhelmingly to stay. The trouble, of course, being that young people voted in much smaller numbers than old people. And I think that that tells you something about the demographic nature of this thing. People who worried about the economic consequences of leaving were young people who worry about their jobs. But old people, of course, are retired. They don't have a job. So they worry less about that, and they worry more about changes to their society and migration. But the other thing, partly in answer to that question, is there's also a very strong correlation with better educated people voting for Remain and less well-educated people voting to leave. And I think that that made it much, that divide made it much harder for the Remain campaign to get across to people what the benefits of staying in are. Shall I stop there? And
okay.
We can go on to what next
and then we can
later.
Let me turn to Clements first, because Clements, you've spent a long time in Great Britain, so you understand that side, but also as an economist, you can see the economic consequences and you can see the political consequences sitting here. Would you like to tackle that? How serious do you think the consequences are of this vote? Is this an irreversible shock?
Yes, thanks, Quentin. So first of all, as John said, I think this is one of the rare cases where the virtually unanimous prediction of economists, starting with the IMF, the Bank of England, and many others, including the IFO Institute, the unanimous prediction is that this will have serious economic consequences. So the IMF has predicted that the UK will fall back into recession next year. Others have predicted long-term damage. The IMF has said the long-term damage for the UK will be between 2% and 5% of GDP, and it might be more. Now, of course, these predictions say the long-term damage will obviously depend on the arrangement, on the future arrangement between the UK and the EU. I personally think that the economic consequences will develop in three phases. So the first phase is behind us. This was the first day after the referendum and the reaction of financial markets. And I think what was interesting there was that the UK's stock exchange fell by 3%. The pound fell by 8%. The stock exchange in Greece fell by 15%, and the stock exchange in Italy and Madrid by approximately 14%. So what does this tell us? Maybe not very much, because there is a lot of herding going on. It's hard to say how this is related to fundamentals, but one possible interpretation would be to say, okay, if we think about the future economic consequences, first of all, the fact that the UK has a flexible exchange rate will help the UK in sort of absorbing this shock. It's clear that most of the shock does hit the UK, but the flexibility of the exchange rate will help. For the Eurozone, this seems to question let's say, resilience of the Eurozone against crisis. That would be the message of this first day. People are getting more skeptical. Maybe it was just more risk aversion in the short term, but the other message would be, this questions the expectation that the Eurozone will be resilient in the next crisis. That's why people get worried about, places like Italy in particular. And so on. So this was sort of the first message. The next phase is the next months, I believe, where there will be negotiations and a lot of uncertainty about how UK political institutions will react to this. Will there be an official declaration at all that the UK wants to exit? I think this will last a long time because, and maybe this is something for the EU to think about, the procedure for exit is so negative and so biased against countries that are willing to exit that they actually cannot use the procedure, and I think the UK will not use it. So the Article 50 procedure says you declare first then there is a 2-year deadline, and within these 2 years, both sides have to come to an arrangement. Now, if there is a minority, a blocking minority of 35% of countries who do not want an arrangement, who want to maximize the damage, they can do it. They can just block the arrangement, and after 2 years, everything will be over. The UK would just exit from the EU without any arrangement. If you want to be constructive and minimize the damage, you need a qualified majority, which is much more difficult. You need a qualified majority in the Council. And if you want a longer deadline, you need unanimity. Okay, so in this procedure, it is quite clear that those who want a bad outcome and those who want to punish the UK have a lot of leverage. Maybe it won't come to that, but their negotiation power will be enormous. And that's why, in fact, I personally think that it is in the interest not just of the UK, but of the EU and the UK to negotiate before. Now, of course, currently everybody commits, says we are not negotiating. I can understand that you cannot one day after a referendum like this say, okay, we will ignore the rules of Article 50 and do something else. But my understanding is that this will inevitably happen. So there will be negotiations before the declarations, and then the declaration will come. My view is there is no other way for the UK to exit from the Union. And last point. I think it is very much against the interest of the EU to punish the UK or to try to do damage to the UK. If the EU does that, it will just confirm something Nigel Farage said about the EU, which is that this is an organization which is interested in power and that will hit out very hard at everybody in their way. I think this is a caricature, it's a completely wrong description of the EU, but I can now see a danger that some of that will come into the debate. And I think the first reactions, in particular from the leaders of the EU, in fact, were kind of kindergarten. One message was there will be punishment to scare off other countries. We've learned from the UK referendum that economic disadvantages will not scare off voters. And the second message was, now in the rest of the EU, we need to make a big leap towards more integration. Juncker really said he wants to extend the euro to all EU 27 states. It's very hard to take that seriously. Thank you.
Can I just come back, though, Clements, on it strikes me that at the core of this, you have a balancing act between trying to stop economic contagion to the markets and so on of Europe, which requires a stabilizing strategy from Europe. That's to say, let's do a deal that won't upset people and so on. But the political contagion danger is such that you do need to demonstrate that you can't leave the European Union and keep all the benefits without any of the costs. So there are clearly people in Britain today who are saying, we can stay members of the single market, but we won't have freedom of labour movement. Is that possible from your perspective?
I don't think it's possible, but I don't have the impression that the current mood in the UK is this can be done lightly. I think that's not the danger. So people who have this more antagonistic view of what's coming say we need to make sure that other countries don't think this is easy. It's easy to leave. I don't think anybody in the UK or elsewhere has the impression that this is easy. And it's also clear that we need to protect the internal market. And migration is part of it. So there must be some kind of deal. If there is a restriction on migration, there must be financial compensation or a price in terms of access to the common market. I think that's right. But rather than phrasing this as a conflict between the EU and the UK, I would prefer to phrase this as a debate between those who want to keep Britain in Europe and those who don't.
Right. The trouble is, of course, those who don't include rather a lot of my compatriots.
Yes, they do.
But not all of them.
Elmar, how do you think that the institutions of Europe and the nations of Europe should react to this? What would, and what if the next British government simply refuses to apply for Article 50?
Yes, first of all, I think we heard this lesson, not just for Britain, but all of us. If you think the European Union is a good thing, you should talk sometimes positively about it. That applies to all the governments and to business. Europe is not just bureaucratic because of some energy things and something like that. It's a success story of making out of 28 laws, one law, which created the internal market, which is a success story for your business. We do a lot of mistakes, but we have not a privilege to do mistakes alone. Sometimes they happen also in Berlin and Munich and Paris. The second point is, this Brexit might help to come to this situation. Marianne Rajoy, who I met in the EPP meeting on Tuesday, said, thanks to Brexit, I won the elections. Because he said, Podemos and the populist party, which are in Spain on the left side, but argue in the same way as on the right side in other countries, like populist movements never right or left. It's a mixture. And Erod said me yesterday, the opinion polls for Le Pen are going down as a result of Brexit. Because people start to see which negative impact it might have in reality, if you have such a story. Therefore, I like to see it a little bit more, what is happening in Britain and gets awareness in other countries. Secondly, we have to anyway to reform the European Union with or without Brexit. Partly on migration, I said it before. We have to become better in delivery. Not in new institutional debates, but in delivery. And here, member states have to play an important role in that. But if Britain is concerned, I found a 20-year-old book, First Among Equals, from Jeffrey Archer, my bookshelf. My God, it was the same story.
Yeah.
But at that time, at least because of the Northern Ireland played a role there, it had a positive outcome, because every good novel must have a positive outcome. But what this Cameron and Johnson did, this lads from Oxford to have their own personal place on the back of a country in the continent, it's one of the most incredible, irresponsible behaviors I've seen in European politics in the last 40, 50 years. And this must be aware. And they do not want to take responsibility for that and run away. And it was a personal gain for their ego. There's a lot of lies. Mixing up Polish movement of workers with migration from Pakistan, which is not a problem, to make it black and white. And here we have to take that into account, what we do now. We have to go after the roots, calm and firm. No time for revenge. At the end, we have to live peaceful together with that island in the Atlantic Ocean. That's a quote by John Kerry.
Iceland, you mean?
Yeah. But they cannot come so far as Iceland, because Iceland is in the European internal market, pays money for Polish structural funds for European research policy, and has free movement of labor accepted in the internal market as the rules. They can have the Icelandic rule, but they will not get it because this is they want not to take. So they will be in a less close to the European Union as Iceland, or Switzerland, or Norway. And this is one of the big lies. They say, let's take the Norwegian solution. The Norwegian solution means take everything, but have nothing to say anymore. Bravo. Yeah. Bravo. And if they want to make up their mind that, then I would prefer to stay in. And therefore, we have to, not to force them, to make it clear that they have to apply Article 50, which is not a negotiation of a refusal relationship, it's a divorce negotiation. A very practical divorce negotiation. How many years they have to pay for the pensions of the European bureaucrats of the last 43 years? Until the last one of them has died, they have to take pay their share for their pensions. For sure. It's divorce negotiation. It's like in real life. And all this has to be done. It's a nasty divorce negotiation. And in Article 50 is written at the end, in the framework of future relations. That is not the future relations, is to say which it might be. It's two different negotiations.
Correct.
And here we have now, after some turmoil and misunderstanding of dates, a common position of Parliament, Commission, and Council. And Parliament plays a role. Parliament has to ratify the exit treaty, which we will do in the same way as an enlargement agreement the other way around, and for the future relations agreement, which Britain has to negotiate as a first country, as a third country, So they have to start it from the beginning, which also the European Parliament has to ratify after Lisbon. And here we will have to see what is possible. And it's also important that everyone has said, including Mrs. Merkel, who was differently mentioned in British media, no informal talks before. This is the instrument to get Article 50 working. Because what Johnson and others tried to do, what Theresa May will try again, is let's talk before, make another deal. If we do another deal, for example, without free movement of labor, we give up one of the 4 principles of the internal market. Why should stay then Poland within the European Union? If you would say less for structural funds on top of the rebate. The structural funds were invented in the 80s, that we said the internal market is there to use it tariff-free, all without any controls, also non-tariff barriers for the countries with big exports. And it was the other side of the coin, to give the weaker countries support for their development. Why should go the weaker countries into the internal market if we do not create a win-win situation of that?
Can I write to that?
So therefore, you can make regional policy better. But it's a condition that the weaker countries take part in that. It's a political condition. The Germans would like also to have it without regional policy, because it costs us money. But that's the price for it. Without that price, no internal market. It's a political deal. People have to understand, and an economically wise deal. And therefore, there will be no future results with as member of the internal market without taking this into account as your burden. You cannot have in any community that some people carry the loads and others have only the advantages. Why? It will not work. And what our main concern at the moment is, have no followers, have no referendum in the Netherlands, in Austria, in Denmark, and so on. And here we have to be very cautious. And therefore, such a deal would not be possible. Would not be possible. We told it several times, but it was nearly unimpossible, with the exception of Financial Times and Guardian, to bring such a thing into British media in that time of the referendum campaign. And this would mean that we would be ready to negotiate any deal. We would be ready to take the exit from the exit, but under the present conditions. Under the present conditions. And let's see how far the realism comes back to Britain. It's now much more difficult, because a referendum is a referendum. You have to take the decision of the people seriously, despite it comes with lies, despite many people who voted on Thursday last week with exit, would vote now with Remain. I believe today the Remain would win with a big majority, but we have to follow this legal line. This is not punishment. This is realism, and that is rules. This is not punishment. And this must be very clear, and then we have to find a way, perhaps as a full member at the end of the day. I do not exclude that. We would be open for that under these rules. And the last point, I was involved in these negotiations about the agreement from February. Partly, it were my sentences.
Brexit light.
This is my sentences in it.
Yeah.
A discussion with Cameron and others. And they got everything what they wanted. There are many people say now, they have less responsibilities than Norway does. Norway is a member of Schengen. Who doesn't know that? With open borders. Switzerland too. And they have no ever closer union for them. It's still in obligation for all of us, not for them. Monetary union, they are not for them. But it's written in that agreement. Therefore must say that you're not right. It's in that all countries who have no opt-out or opt-in, it means Britain and England, have to follow the rules of going to their rules, the obligations to move to the euro. It's the Treaty of Maastricht and therefore Lisbon, and it's in this agreement. Yeah. The countries who have no opt-out have the obligations to follow the route for further. It might last a long time for some countries, but Britain tried to create a group of the Euro country and the non-Euro countries. And because of the intervention of the European Parliament in that negotiation, it's no. It was the opt-out countries on one side and on the other side, the Euro or not yet Euro countries. That's the only way to keep the treaty and move forward. And therefore, this has to be seen that these are, I think, not much possible to go much further than that. Less obligations for Britain, but please do not destroy the obligations for the others. Right. And please have no influence on Britain, what the others do. This was also agreed. They have said you can deepen the monetary union, you can deepen political union, but without us, fine, then without you, but please do not stop us now.
Fine, thank you, Emma. I want to come back to John now to also tackle this question of the way ahead and the question of can it be done, should it be done, must it be done on Article 50? Is it this incredibly extended process that is a 2-year exit process and then, let us say, an 8-year negotiation process of the long-term trading arrangement outside the single market, with this extraordinary situation where the UK government, I believe, now has 35 trade negotiators still in employment, and the estimate is they will need 750 to manage the negotiations. Bit of rapid training needed.
I mean, the answer is it's going to be very difficult. Whether it is Theresa May or Michael Gove as two front runners, they will face a very difficult decision whether to invoke Article 50. I think they will put it off as long as they can. But I also share Elmar's view that for obvious reasons, the other countries will say, we can't negotiate over a Brexit unless you invoke Article 50. And that's why Article 50 was written like that. It was written to make it uncomfortable for
Could they start simply breaking the rules and then
I think they're unlikely
suspended?
To do that. I mean, at one point, Michael Gove talked about passing an act to cancel the authority of the European Court of Justice or repealing the 1972 European Communities Act. If he did do either of those things, that would be illegal in international law, European law, and probably in British law as well.
But these people are fanatics, they don't care.
I think a government would, I hope a government would be more responsible than that. But they will, as I say, put off, as long as they can, the invocation of Article 50. So I would not expect it to happen in September. It may not happen for 2 or 3 months afterwards. And I actually do think that for all sides, Merkel is right to say, let's take time over this. There is no advantage in being rapid or speedy, because this is going to be an extremely difficult negotiation for all sides. And throwing yourself into it very quickly increases the risk of getting a bad outcome of the kind that Clements was talking about. Having said that, it is drawn up in such a way as to make life very difficult. It is a unilateral divorce by one country that's voted to leave, but the terms of the divorce are determined by the rest of the countries without that country's having a say in it, and that is not a recipe for happiness all round. So there is going to be pain in this, and it's going to be increased because everybody in Britain agrees that the reason Leave won was because Leave voters wished to see restrictions on migration. And it's fine to be told, and I agree with Elmar, that you can't be in the single market if you do not accept the free movement of people. But the new British government, I think, will say, if that is the conclusion, I'm afraid we will have to give up the single market. That would be a terrible mistake for Britain, and I don't think it would be good for the European Union. But they need something on migration. Now, whether you can find
the agreement.
They did get something, but it obviously wasn't enough.
But they didn't use it.
Whether you can get something else on migration, I don't know. But I think that the negotiation will start to zero in on, is there something more we could do on the benefits rules, on allowing countries, all countries, not just Britain, to apply restrictions in the case of sudden surges of migration. This will be part of the controversial debate. Can we do anything at all on migration that allows Britain to somehow find its way into a Norway or Norway-light situation? I'm skeptical that it can be done, but I'm sure that's where the negotiation will be. And the two other things I would just add very quickly. The first thing that I think is important to get across to the British is the immediate response after the referendum was to say, let's look to Angela Merkel. Angela Merkel will find some way of solving this problem, because that is the traditional approach in Europe. And it's possible she will, but I think the idea that Angela Merkel can produce a rabbit out of the hat that somehow or other solves this problem, I think is probably wrong.
No, Angela Merkel's not the rabbit, she's the person who pulls it.
She pulls it. So I think the idea that we can be rescued by her is not, it may not be as easy as it sounds. And as Elmar quite rightly said, if Germany and the German Chancellor has two problems in front of her, one is keep the European Union intact, and the other is please the British, she would prefer to keep the European Union intact, and it's perfectly logical for her to be in that position. So I think
even if it means sacrificing a very significant market for Germans.
Yeah, it does. I think if that's the choice, it would come to that, and I think the new British Prime Minister will find that. But the other thing I would caution against is for a message for our continental allies, as we like to think of them. The idea that it will be easy to reverse this process and say, after all, we want to stay in the European Union, that is also extremely difficult. It would clearly, in my view, and no doubt Quentin's, obviously, it would be a desirable thing to do. But it's not easy. This is not a situation like Ireland and the Lisbon Treaty or Denmark and the Maastricht Treaty. It is not going to be at all easy to change our minds, which is one of the reasons why I think taking a bit of time over it would be good, because if the British economy suffers as Clements thinks it will, if the numbers of migrants fall as a result, the best way to reduce migration is to trash your economy. Then it may be in 2 or 3 years' time faced with a choice of Norway with bad things in it, or maybe we should change our minds. That is a conceivable outcome, but I would not like to rest many hopes on the idea that Britain can easily reverse this referendum.
I'll come to you in a second. I want to go to Clements just on, is there any way you can conceive, Clements, of having restrictions on the free movement of labour within, if there were a way for everybody in the European Union to accept a situation? I mean, if one looks at it from the new member states' point of view in Central Eastern Europe, they are actually suffering a pretty serious brain drain. Mightn't they be persuaded that actually a restraint of some sort, maybe that says you can only move when you've got an absolutely cast-iron job offer or whatever, can you conceive of that?
Well, interestingly, the brain drain doesn't seem to be the big issue. I mean, even for I think the Eastern European countries would be on board if we said, we will introduce some kind of...
Well, I was thinking of the Romanian health service, which has got practically no doctors left.
But it doesn't seem to me that this is a major issue in the political debate. I think it's a real issue, but it's not one that seems to be driving politics. I mean, what is driving them and what would make them ready to accept restrictions on migration is immigration. In fact, I mean, they are worried about, asylum seekers immigrating to these countries. I do think, though, that it is important to protect the internal market as it is, including migration, but migration into the labor market. I think, there's no reason for Europe not to think about how we can reconcile, as Gabriel Felbermayr today said, how we can reconcile free movement of people with the welfare states we have today. You know, I'm not sure that the EU rules as they are today are the last word on this. But let me react to what Elmar just said. You know, if I'm getting more worried as I listen to him, if we phrase this as an ugly divorce, we are doing harm, I'm convinced, to Europe. The UK will stay in Europe. It will not be some island in the Atlantic Ocean. It's a central country to Europe. And I think we need to distinguish two things. One thing is, how do we deal with this procedure? Yeah. You know, I mean, we have said many times in the EU, the rules are this, the rules are that, but it's not respected. Now, I'm not in favor of disrespecting rules, but to me, it's crystal clear that there will be talks before. Will there be public? I don't know, but of course, there will be negotiations before the British declare their exit. I can imagine no other outcome. And we need to distinguish this question from the other question, which is, you know, what kind of deal will be accepted? And I think there is so much, you know, there are so many margins of negotiations that I wouldn't be so pessimistic. It's not a binary choice. You know, it's not either you accept everything or you accept nothing. Like it or not, you know, it will be more like a bazaar about, you know, how much does Britain contribute to EU programs? Where do they get market access? Financial services will be, of course, the big issue. And what kind of restrictions will they get on migration? And you know, I'm optimistic. Somehow it's always been worked in Europe. You know, we find some compromise. Nobody's really happy, but you know, we'll prevent the worst from happening.
Okay. Elmar, I want to take questions from the floor, and I know you want to come back in.
Can I just answer on that?
30 seconds and then you'll open
No, this is the principal question. We talk about primary law. This primary law can only be changed by unanimity in all 28 member countries when we talk about free movement of labor. And even if you do it as only the part of the Brexit agreement where 35% have veto, you have to see all Eastern European countries will not accept it. All South European countries will not accept it. All federalists will not accept it. And all left politicians will not accept that. No chance.
Sounds like a bit of a blocking minority.
There's no chance. And the European Parliament would not get a majority in the European Parliament for that, which has to ratify. What we have to do is what we partly did, I think, in a good thing in that agreement. We have to overcome the misuse of free movement in Europe, and you have to use it in national politics. It's all there. When you if you move from one European country to another, you must have a job. And at least 5 years, European Court of Justice just have said it, you have not to pay anything to such a person. No, it's written in the law. I was at that time, 94, a spokesperson for social policy of my group, and we negotiated at that time with the Council President Norbert Blüm. That law is still there. It says, and if you go to another EU country without having a job, you must prove that you have enough income for you and your relatives and health insurance system when you want to live in that other country. Why we do not use that? We in Germany, Mrs. Nahles has now started a law that in these 5 years you get not Hartz IV. We could have done that 20 years ago. Now people start to avoid that. The second point is the question with in-work benefit. Britain got that because this is a special thing, a very modern one, but it does not apply to social policy, but they got the 7 years transitional period. That is the question of truth and reality. I had in 2005 twice a debate with British ministers in Warsaw. They blamed me as an ugly German there in the public because we made a transitional period for me movement of labor from the new member countries, and we, Britain, take them all in the first moment. That was their campaign. And will I never forget these 2 meetings in Warsaw. And now, February, we gave them another 7 years to try it at the end. But both possibilities mentioned in that agreement, which I have said here, were not used in the campaign. if they would have them properly, strongly in the campaign, they could have broken this migration debate where they're mixing everything up. And it would be very difficult. Also, the childcare is part of that, the question. So that you have, if the children are not in Britain or in Germany, you have to pay only the amount of money compared to the GNP of that country where they live. Which is anyway would be a good solution. But this is the maximum. We had to make a secondary law about it. And you cannot imagine how difficult it is in the European Parliament, for example, to get a majority in secondary law for that. Because it's discrimination and so on is the debate about it. So I would not say it's easily now to do that. It's not to have follows in other countries, and there's a question of majority to do that. Therefore, we should not look in this easy situation. After one deal, reject one deal, you get a better deal. If that's the method, then you break it everything.
Okay, let's open it up to the floor. I saw Ingo Friedrich. Yeah. I've got 3 questions, I think I've seen.
Right.
Yes?
Ich glaube, wir tun richtig, wenn wir Großbritannien nicht bestrafen. Der Dominoeffekt, den wir alle vermeiden müssen, wird hoffentlich, und das erwarte ich auch, allein durch das Beispiel, was passiert in diesem riesigen Land, Empire AD, Großbritannien, durch den Austritt der EU. Allein dieses Faktum, dass das Austreten praktisch einem Land immens schadet, das kann und sollte ausreichen, um den Dominoeffekt zu vermeiden. Aber eine andere Konsequenz, und jetzt meine Frage, die Slowakei übernimmt heute die Ratspräsidentschaft. Und die Botschaft ist, jetzt aber mehr nationale und regionale Kompetenzen. Wenn man diesen Weg geht, dann kann natürlich Deutschland sagen, okay, Energiewende, nationale Kompetenz. Oder Steuerschlupfloch, nationale Kompetenz. Dann kann man natürlich den ganzen Binnenmarkt mit mehr nationaler Selbstständigkeit wieder aufdröseln. Ist dies der richtige Weg?
Nein.
Und die zweite Frage, damit schließe ich auch an die Experten, für wen arbeitet die Zeit? Wenn also wir jetzt erst im September oder vielleicht erst im Januar 2017 den Scheidungsantrag auf dem Tisch haben, die 6, 7 Monate bis dorthin, wem schadet die mehr? England oder der Europäischen Union?
Okay, thanks. Katinka Barish.
Thank you. One question to John. What is Nicola Sturgeon going to do? Is she going to start the referendum, the Scottish referendum process now to put maximum pressure on London, or is she going to wait until 2 alternatives are on the table between the New Deal that she gets inside the UK and the prospect of staying a full member of the EU? And a question to Elmar Brok. Do you believe that you and the leaders in Brussels, the top officials and your colleagues in the European Parliament, when you insist on the absolute sanctity of EU law and the necessity to react to the Brexit vote with further integration, enlarging the Eurozone, going further, do you believe yourself in line with European public opinion as it stands at the moment? Or does that matter?
Thank you very much. John Kornblum.
I was going to say something very similar. What should we call it? The spectacle in Brussels, the reactions, the many, many reactions after the British vote demonstrate, Elmar, that there's no consensus inside of the EU either, and there's especially no consensus between Brussels and the rest of the EU. And so I think that Angela Merkel's approach that lets everybody just go on holiday for a while is by far the best thing to do. People have to calm down. This is as if the United States had to face the prospect of California leaving the Union. We're a union too, after all, let's remember that. And if California decided to leave, you think we would run around punishing them? No, we wouldn't. We'd figure a way to keep them in. And we had another case of that when the southern states wanted to leave the Union. Abraham Lincoln was counseled to negotiate with them. And he rightfully noted that if they all leave, we don't have a union anymore. So you're facing these two issues, and it's just not going to be that simple.
But he waged war for that.
That's right, and he had to, because otherwise the union would have collapsed. So you're facing these two options, and it's going to be a lot harder than you think it is.
Don't invade. Don't invade.
I wonder if I've got time for 2 rounds of questions. If everybody keeps their answers quite short, I'll get another round of questions in, okay? So, John, why don't you start off, and maybe with Scotland.
Okay.
And I'm actually going to turn the question round then, and I want to ask either Elmar or Clements whether he thinks there's a chance of Scotland getting in on its own, in spite of the Spanish resistance. But talk about Ms. Sturgeon, one of the most honest people in this referendum campaign.
And she was one of the best campaigners, and she made the best case for staying in the European Union much more effectively than David Cameron. And of course, she did win a substantial majority in Scotland. But I think my answer to Katinka is I think, like everybody else, she also will wait. She clearly has, as she said in the manifesto before the Scottish election last year, if there is a Brexit, that is a material change in the conditions for Scotland, and it is enough of a material change to justify a second independence referendum. That is the belief that she has and her party has. But, of course, a Brexit makes the prospect of an independent Scotland much more complicated. It's not just because the oil prices has gone down and the Scottish economy doesn't look as good as it did 2 years ago, but the prospect or the risk that there might have to be a genuine border with England would be very disruptive for Scotland, just as it is going to be potentially very disruptive for Northern Ireland.
Nightmare in Northern Ireland.
And is therefore a nightmare for both Northern Ireland and the Republic. Yeah. And I think in both Northern Ireland and Scotland, the sensible thing for them to do is to say we want to wait and see precisely what agreement comes out of this process before we decide what to do next. Clearly, Northern Ireland would prefer there to be no border between the north and the south. The Scots, I think, would just like to know what the condition is. If Britain were to end up in some way in a Norwegian-like situation, then life would be somewhat simpler for Scotland than if it doesn't. But the decision for Scotland is a difficult one, and I think Nicola Sturgeon is also aware that to hold a referendum and lose a second time would kill off independence for many years. So I think she will take time. And I'm afraid I still think, in answer to Ingo Friedrich, that delay probably, for the reasons that John Kornblum gave, is a good idea for all sides, at least for now. I think you know, and I'm talking about really for the next 3-4 months. Before the end of the year, Britain will need to decide, does it want to invoke Article 50? I think that's absolutely clear. But I don't think anybody would gain from doing that early.
Right. Clements, would you like to come in on and pick any of those?
Yes, a short comment on the independence of Scotland. I happen to have been a member of the so-called Royal Commission on the Fiscal Devolution of Scotland. They had an expert group, a long time ago, and that was very interesting because one of the results was that I believe the devolution of Scotland will be a lot more complicated than Brexit, for the simple reason that Scotland is currently a strong net recipient of fund from the rest of the UK. There would be enormous problems dividing up the national debt and so on. So it's a very complicated process, and Scotland would lose out. I don't know if they study this more, whether they will still want to go, I believe, more or less irrespective of the result of the exit process. I think the time question is interesting. How will this work out? Who will give in first? I think it's very hard to predict, but I'm not sure it's the UK. I mean, I think that the UK can live, given that they have these uncertainty issues anyway, they can live for a certain time, in this situation where they just say, okay, we want to negotiate first, so we'll wait.
An awful lot will depend on the markets, won't it?
Yes, but my prediction is there will be negotiations relatively quickly before the declaration.
Okay. Elmar, on the sanctity of EU law?
Look, if we give up principal law, we will not get a majority for that. We have even one country can stop that, and therefore forget it. So far, we at the moment cannot have a change of the treaties in a positive way to go forward. No chance of ratification. You have no chance of ratification, go the other way around. There's a studies of the British government and a study of the German Employers Associations 2-3 years ago, bringing competences back to nation state. The result of both studies is 0, because it destroys the internal market in practical terms, if you do that. In both cases, it's 0. It's blah, blah, blah. It was also not asked for by Cameron because of this reason, these negotiations in February. And what we have to do is to get in this procedure to avoid further uncertainty. To have this situation, what we have now, another 2-3 years without having even a procedure how to solve it, would be a disastrous uncertainty politically and economically. Therefore, start a procedure, and when it becomes clear, even when you have started a procedure and asked for Article 50, you can take it back, and we would accept that, if there's a chance for an exit of an exit, despite all the legal problems, but it would be done. With Scotland,
that's a trick, Elmar. That's a legal trick. You know, I like it, but it's a trick. If you say they can take it back.
Might be. I would prefer to have a united Kingdom in the European Union.
So would I.
It's not going to be easy.
But Mrs. Sturgeon was in Brussels this week.
Yeah.
I have these meetings, the feeling she will try to go out. Sincere feeling. It was a very well prepared trip. And there's also the question, they fulfill at the moment every detail of European law. They have not to negotiate the acquis communautaire. There's, I think I've heard in this agreement for the autonomy of Scotland, that they have made the commitment to fulfill European law. And Sturgeon says, oh, I will fulfill these commitments, even London tries to stop me to do so. It's a difficult legal situation. You have to see, and this question was asked what has to do with enlargement of the euro. That every country which fulfills the condition has to join the euro group is law. It's primary law.
But Sweden ignores it.
Therefore, it's a case for the European Court of Justice. But you have to see that even at the time of the crisis, countries joined. The Eurozone became bigger and have the feeling that the new members mostly better fulfilling the conditions than some of the old members. And therefore, I would not worry because of that. It's their choice, their national choice, if they have to fulfill, to do that, or not, they have even to do that. And we have to deliver. I said no changes of competences. But whether the European has competences, it must have the instruments to fulfill these competences. At the moment, people do not ask us anymore, Europe is too bureaucratic, it's always solved. Barroso had in his last year 188 proposals for law. Juncker, 28. This anti-bureaucracy is going forward in a good way, as we promised 2 years ago in the European elections. Instead of 188, 28. You might not like all of them, but it's an incredible, positive way of not more and more detailed Europe. But in question of terror, migration, and a few other things, people want that we deliver. And here we have to do that. It's not more Europe, it's better Europe. It's better Europe, and we have to produce a better Europe to bring the people back, that we see that we can take part in that. And again, please do not misunderstand Mrs. Merkel. I hope one sentence to that. If she says, take your time, it has not mean to do it today, but it thinks about September and October, not about next year.
Okay.
Well, you are dealing with a country that we always used to think was thoroughly pragmatic and sensible and so on. And I remember, actually, it was one of Chancellor Kohl's advisors who said to me quite a long time ago, how come your country's become so ideological? It is quite worrying that we have had such an extraordinarily important decision taken in the most casual way, with a referendum, without the law being drafted, setting particular ceilings on taking decisions, that 50% plus one vote would decide it, and then we say it's set in stone. I hope and pray there is a way of reasserting the power of Parliament over the referendum. It is actually a constitutional nightmare that we have. It's certainly a Pandora's box. And there will be a lot to talk about in the future, but I'd like to thank the panelists very much for the debate. I hope you all found it enlightening. Thank you.